The October the Vance family lost their lease, 12-year-old Nettie Vance did not cry, did not argue, and did not ask her father what would happen to them. She did something else entirely. She started walking the tree line behind the old Bristow place with a hatchet in one hand and a notebook in the other, marking which fallen locust trees were sound enough to split and which had already gone soft with rot. She was not thinking about where her family would sleep. She was thinking about where the wood would stay dry. Nobody had asked her to think about that. Nobody had told her it mattered more than almost anything else that winter. She had simply noticed, the way certain children notice, that the whole household's survival was about to come down to a stack of split oak and whether or not rain could reach it. If stories about grit, family, and the kind of wisdom that shows up in unexpected places move you, subscribe, and join us every week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone, and we would love to know how far this story has traveled. The Vances had rented the same 60 acres in Coldwater Hollow, in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, for 11 years. It was not fine land. It sloped hard in 3 directions, flooded in the low corner every spring, and the house itself had been built in the 1940s by a man who believed in function over comfort. But it was home, and it was affordable. And Nettie's father, a quiet man named Dale Vance, had put a decade of small repairs into a house that was never his to keep. In September, the landlord, an elderly man named Curtis Reddick, who had held the property since his own father passed it down, sold the entire tract to a logging company out of Ashland. The new owners wanted the house gone, and the acreage cleared. The Vances were given 8 weeks. Curtis Reddick was not an unkind man. He came out to the house himself to deliver the news rather than sending a letter, stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and told Dale he was sorry, that the offer from the logging company was more money than he could turn down at his age, with his own health the way it was, and that he understood full well what 8 weeks meant for a family with 3 kids and a lease instead of a deed. He offered what little he could, an extra $100 toward moving expenses and first pick of any scrap lumber the demolition crew did not want once the old house came down. It did not change the math. It did not put a proper roof over anyone's head any faster, and it certainly did not solve the problem of where a family was supposed to keep a winter's worth of firewood dry with nothing built yet on the land they actually owned. Dale did not have 8 weeks' worth of options. What he had was 4 acres of steep, rocky ground his own grandfather had left him decades earlier, a piece of family land nobody had ever built on because nobody had ever needed to. It sat 2 ridges over, thick with second-growth timber, no house, no barn, no shed, nothing but a spring, a dirt track, and a single wide trailer his uncle had left behind years before, rusted at the seams but still standing. Dale moved the family in the 2nd week of October. There was no time to build anything proper. There was barely time to get the trailer's water line thawed and the roof patched before the first hard frost came through. Nettie's mother, Renata, worked at a school cafeteria 40 minutes away and could not take time off without losing the job outright. So most days it fell to Dale and the 3 kids to get the new place livable. Nettie was the middle child, sandwiched between her older brother Colton, 16 and mostly interested in getting his driver's license, and her younger brother Miles, 8, who followed her everywhere and asked questions she did not always have the patience to answer. It was Nettie who noticed, within the first week on the new land, that the trailer's little wood stove was the only heat source they had, and that the family did not own so much as a lean-to to keep firewood under. Her grandfather, on her mother's side, a man named Earl Tackett, had been a welder for 30 years at a fabrication shop in Ashland before he retired, and in his younger years, before that, he had spent 2 winters working construction on a job site that used old military surplus Quonset huts for equipment storage. Earl was 74 now, lived alone in town since his wife had passed 6 years earlier, and came out to the new place most weekends to help however his knees would allow. He had a way of talking about that old job site the way some men talk about a war they were in, not with drama, just with the specific, worn, smooth detail of someone who had lived inside a memory long enough to know every edge of it. He remembered the huts had come stamped with a manufacturer's plate from a company that had built thousands of them for the government decades before he ever saw one. Remembered that the curved shape had originally been chosen because it used the least steel for the most covered floor space, and remembered, most of all, that a hut with a bad foundation would rot from the bottom up no matter how good the roof over it was. It was Earl who first used the phrase Quonset hut, out loud in front of Nettie, half as a joke, describing the curved steel shelters from that old site, buildings that shed rain and snow like a duck's back because they had no flat roof for anything to sit and pool on. Nettie did not think it was a joke. She asked her grandfather to describe the shape again. Half a barrel, he told her, laid on its side, ribs curving from ground to ground in a single smooth arch, sheeted over in corrugated metal, open at both ends unless you wanted to close them in. Cheap to build if you had scrap, miserable to build if you didn't understand how the curve carried weight, because an arch that isn't anchored right will fight you the whole way up and then spring back flat the second you let go. He told her about a man on that old crew who lost 2 fingers to a panel that kicked loose mid-bend, and he told her that story again, almost word for word, 3 separate times over the following weeks, the way people repeat the lessons they most want to make sure actually land. She wrote it all down in the same notebook she used for marking trees, in handwriting her grandfather later said looked like a surveyor's, though nobody had ever taught her that. Here is what Nettie understood before anyone else in the family fully did. It was not enough to just stack firewood somewhere out of the rain. Wood that sits on bare dirt draws moisture up out of the ground no matter what sits over the top of it. Wood that is sheltered but sealed too tightly never sheds the moisture already inside it, and it will mold, and it will smoke, and it will burn cold and dirty in a stove that needs to be running hot and clean to get a family through a hill country winter. She had read a little about this in an old woodworking pamphlet of her grandfather's, one about seasoning lumber, and she had also simply watched, the way she watched everything, how firewood that sat under the porch overhang at the old rental house always burned better than firewood that got covered with a tarp. The tarp trapped water. The overhang let air move. What she needed, she decided, was not a shed. It was a structure with a curved roof to shed rain and snow without pooling, open enough on the ends to let air pull through and carry moisture out, and raised off the ground so nothing wicked up from underneath. In other words, exactly the shape her grandfather had described, just built at woodshed scale instead of equipment storage scale, and built for free because the family did not have money for lumber, much let alone steel. She started collecting material before she told anyone what it was for. That was the pattern with Nettie. She did not announce a plan. She gathered the pieces first and let the plan reveal itself once it was too far along to argue with. Before she ever touched a cattle panel, though, she spent 3 afternoons at the small branch library in town, the same one her mother used to take her to as a much younger child, asking the librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had run the branch for as long as anyone could remember, whether there were any books about old military buildings or about seasoning firewood. Mrs. Pruitt found her one dog-eared paperback on homesteading that had a single chapter on wood storage and an old bound volume of farm bulletins donated years earlier by a local extension office that had since closed, full of line drawings of arched pole barns and instructions on airflow that Nettie copied out longhand because the library would not let the bulletins leave the building. She learned from those few borrowed hours that wood needs to lose moisture from both the cut ends and the split faces to season properly, that stacking it too tightly slows that process down even under a good roof, and that a structure open at both ends will always dry wood faster than one closed-up snug, no matter how waterproof the closed-up one looks. She carried that idea home the same way she carried the notebook, folded into her jacket pocket, and it shaped everything that came after. She walked the property line and found a stretch of woven wire cattle fencing, rusted and half-buried, left over from whatever livestock her great-uncle had once kept on the land. She remembered her grandfather mentioning that cattle panels, the rigid welded kind used for livestock pens, could be bent into an arch if you had the leverage to do it, and that arch, once anchored at both ends, would hold its shape and carry a covering without any rafters at all. It was the same physics as the steel ribs in a real Quonset hut, just scaled down to something a family with no money could actually build. She found 4 cattle panels leaning against the collapsing remains of an old hay barn on a neighboring property, the kind of eyesore most people are relieved to have someone haul away. The owner, a widow named Opal Sizemore, who had more land than she could manage alone, told Nettie to take every last one of them and to please, while she was at it, see if there was anything else back there worth hauling off. Nettie found roofing tin under a collapsed section of that same barn, 12 full sheets, dented in places but structurally sound, the galvanized coating still holding. She found a roll of heavy woven tarp material, the kind used to cover hay bales, folded and forgotten in the barn's loft. She found lengths of rebar, a coil of baling wire, and a stack of wooden pallets someone had left stacked behind a defunct feed store in town, free for the taking if you asked the owner, which Nettie did, twice, until he finally said yes. By the time she was ready to build, in the last week of October, with the first true cold snap already moving through the hollow, the only thing she had actually spent money on was a single tube of exterior-grade silicone caulk and a box of self-tapping screws, $7 and change at the hardware store in town, money she had saved from picking up cans along the county road over the summer. Everything else had been given away, salvaged, or scavenged from things other people considered finished with their usefulness. Her father watched her haul the first cattle panel to the flat spot behind the trailer and did not ask what she was doing. That was Dale's way, the same as it had always been. He noticed things and waited to be shown rather than demanding an explanation up front. Her grandfather Earl, however, could not stay quiet for long. He drove out that Saturday, took one look at the panels laid out on the ground and the pallets stacked to one side, and said, out loud, that she was fixing to build herself a Quonset hut. Nettie did not deny it. She asked him instead how a person kept the arch from springing back flat once you bent it. Earl showed her. "You anchor both ends first," he said, driving lengths of rebar deep into the ground at intervals along 2 parallel lines, spaced exactly the width of a cattle panel apart. Then you take the panel, flex it from one end, and walk it over, forcing the middle up into an arch while the ends stay pinned to the rebar stakes. 2 people can do it. One person straining against a 400-pound coil of steel wire cannot, not safely, not without the whole thing kicking loose and taking a knuckle with it. The first attempt did not go well. Nettie and her brother Colton, who had finally been talked into helping despite his complaints about wasted weekends, tried to bend the first panel alone. The arch sprang loose halfway through, snapping back with enough force to knock Colton backward into the dirt and send Nettie stumbling. Nobody was hurt, but the panel was bent wrong now, kinked in a spot that would never sit flush. She set it aside, salvage for later, and waited for her grandfather's next visit before trying again. The second attempt, with Earl anchoring one end and directing while Nettie and Colton worked the other, went better. They got 3 panels bent and pinned into matching arches, spaced 4 feet apart down a run of about 12 feet, forming the rib structure of a hut just wide enough to walk into and just tall enough at the peak for Dale to stand upright without stooping. But when they laid the first sheet of roofing tin over the arches, it became clear the ribs were not evenly spaced, and the tin buckled instead of lying flat. Nettie had not accounted for how much the panels would vary once bent by hand instead of by machine. She pulled the tin back off, restaked 2 of the ribs, and adjusted until a taut string line run from peak to peak showed them finally matching. The pallets came next, and this was Nettie's own addition, the piece her grandfather had not mentioned because the old Quonset huts he remembered had concrete pads underneath, something the Vances did not have and could not afford. She laid pallets in a single flat layer along the footprint of the hut, wedging smaller scraps of wood underneath the low corners so the whole platform sat level despite the uneven ground. On top of the pallets, she stretched a section of the woven hay tarp, not to seal the wood in, but to break contact between the pallet wood and whatever firewood sat on top of it, since pallet wood itself can hold moisture. The gaps between pallet slats let air move freely underneath. The tarp kept splinters and debris from working up into the stacked wood. It was not a floor in any traditional sense. It was closer to a raised, ventilated pad, and it was exactly what the ground beneath a woodpile actually needed. The roofing tin went up over the arched ribs next, screwed down with the $7 worth of self-tapping screws, each sheet overlapping the next by a few inches so water would run down and off rather than finding a seam to slip through. Nettie caulked every overlap and every screw head with the tube of silicone, not because she had read that this was necessary, but because she had watched her father caulk the trailer's roof fence the week they moved in, and understood, on site, that a screw hole in metal is a hole for water no matter how small it looks. The 2 ends of the hut she left mostly open, exactly as her grandfather had described the original military huts, except she framed each end with scrap 2x4 lumber Colton had pulled from an old fence he was told he could dismantle, and hung a section of the leftover hay tarp across the upper 2/3 of each opening, leaving a gap of about 1.5 feet along the bottom. This was the detail Nettie was proudest of, and the one that took her the longest to work out. She wanted air moving through the structure constantly, pulling moisture out of freshly split wood and out of the air trapped inside, but she did not want snow or blowing rain driving straight through onto the stacked wood during a storm. The tarp panels, hung loose rather than stretched tight, blocked wind-driven precipitation while still letting air breathe underneath and around the edges. It was the same principle as a covered porch that still lets a breeze through, just built small and cheap and specific to a single purpose. The first real test came in the 2nd week of November, when a cold rain moved through the hollow for 2 straight days, the kind of soaking sideways rain that finds every gap in a poorly built structure. Nettie walked out to the hut on the 2nd morning, certain she would find puddles under the pallets and water beaded on the split oak they had already begun stacking inside. Instead, she found the wood dry to the touch, the pallets damp only where wind had pushed a little spray in through the open ends, and no standing water anywhere on the ground beneath. Her father walked the length of the hut with her, said nothing for a long moment, then asked her how much wood the thing could actually hold once it was full. She told him. It was more than enough to get the family through to March, assuming they kept splitting and stacking through December, which they did. Earl came back out in late November to look the finished structure over properly, walking its length with the slow, evaluating gait of a man who had spent 30 years around fabricated steel and knew what a sound structure felt like under a hand pressed flat against it. He tested the tension in the arched panels, checked the overlap on the roofing tin, and pulled gently at the caulked seams to make sure nothing had already started to lift. He told Nettie, in the plain way he told her most things, that she had built something a lot of grown men with actual materials would have gotten wrong on the first try. She told him she had gotten it wrong on the first try, too. He said that was probably why it worked so well the third time. Word moved through Coldwater Hollow the way it does in places where everyone still waves at everyone else on the county road. Opal Sizemore, who had given Nettie the cattle panels and the tin off her collapsing barn, drove out in early December just to see what had become of the pile of scrap she had been meaning to haul to the dump for 2 years. She stood at the open end of the hut for a long while, running a hand along one of the bent panel ribs, and said she hadn't thought a single one of those pieces was good for anything anymore. She asked if she could bring her granddaughter out sometime, a girl about Nettie's age who had just moved in with her for the school year. And Nettie said, of course, and the 2 girls ended up spending most of a Saturday afternoon restacking a section of wood that had settled unevenly, Opal's granddaughter asking question after question about why the split faces all had to face the same direction along the row. A neighbor down the ridge, a retired timberman named Roy Combs, who had built his own woodshed the conventional way, out of dimensional lumber and a flat asphalt shingled roof, came by after hearing about it from Opal and walked the structure twice without saying much. He pulled a split of oak from near the back of the stack, the wood that had been in there longest, and turned it over in his hands, checking the cut face and the bark for any hint of dampness or the early gray bloom of mildew. He found none. He crouched down and ran a finger along the underside of the pallet platform, checking for the soft, spongy give that waterlogged wood gets, and found the pallets dry and sound. He asked Nettie, the way the farmers had once asked a girl very much like her about a different set of pipes in a different county, what she had done differently. She showed him the curve that let snow slide instead of pile, the raised pallet bed that broke contact with the ground, the loose-hung tarp ends that let air move even in a storm. He stood there for a while after that, quiet in the particular way people get quiet when they are recalculating something they thought they already understood. And before he left, he told Dale, not Nettie, that his own woodshed had lost him 2 full cords to rot over the years, and that he might come back in the spring to see about tearing part of it down and doing it her way instead. Mrs. Pruitt from the library heard about it too, from Mrs. Sizemore, and asked Nettie the next time she came in to return the farm bulletins whether she would be willing to write down what she had learned, in her own words, so the library could keep a copy on file for the next person who came in asking about wood storage or old military buildings. Nettie thought that was a strange thing to be asked to do, being 12, but she wrote 4 pages by hand that same week. And Mrs. Pruitt taped them into the back of the same bound volume Nettie had originally copied from, so that the next reader would find both the old extension bulletin and a child's plain account of building the thing for real, one right after the other. By the time the hardest part of winter arrived, the cold snap in late January that dropped the hollow down into single digits for the better part of a week, the Vance family's stove was running on wood that lit fast, burned hot, and threw almost no smoke, because none of it had ever had the chance to take on moisture in the first place. Dale did not have to spend money on kiln-dried bundles from the gas station in town, the way he had feared he might if the woodpile turned wet and moldy the way woodpiles so often did on land with no proper shelter. Renata noticed the house stayed warmer on less wood than it ever had at the old rental, where the woodpile had sat under nothing but a warped sheet of plywood for 11 years and always burned damp by February. Miles, who was 8 and mostly cared about whether the stove was warm enough to dry his mittens by, simply liked that the hut was tall enough for him to walk into and stand up straight, which made him feel, in the particular way small children feel about small victories, Important. There is an old saying among people who work with their hands for a living, the kind of saying passed down more through demonstration than through any book, that a structure's real strength is not in the material, but in whoever understood the forces at work well enough to arrange that material correctly. Nettie Vance did not build a shed that winter. She built an understanding of moisture, gravity, and airflow, expressed in bent steel panels and scavenged tin, and the wood that stayed dry underneath it was really just the proof of the understanding, not the thing itself. The family's actual harvest that winter was not the cordwood, dry and stacked and burning clean through the coldest week Coldwater Hollow had seen in years. It was a 12-year-old girl's refusal to accept that being forced off one piece of land before winter meant her family had to spend that winter cold, and her patience in working out, piece by scavenged piece, exactly what would keep them warm instead. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a family once the hardest part of a hard year is finally behind them. Not celebration exactly, just a loosening. A room breathing out after holding its breath for months. Renata noticed it first, on a Sunday afternoon in February, when she came home from a rare weekend shift to find all 3 kids and Dale sitting around the little wood stove playing cards, the trailer warm all the way to its far corners. For the first time since they had moved in, the stove drawing clean and hot on wood that lit on the first match. She did not say much about it at the time. She simply sat down and joined the game. And later that night, after the kids were asleep, she told Dale that she had stopped worrying, somewhere around the middle of January, about whether they would make it through to spring. She had not realized how much of her worry had been about the wood specifically until the worry was gone. Nettie is 13 now. The hut still stands behind the trailer, its tin roof a little more weathered, its arched ribs holding just as true as the day her grandfather first showed her how to anchor them. She has already started talking to Earl about widening it before next fall, adding 2 more bays so there is room enough to season 2 winters' worth of wood at once instead of just 1. An idea that came to her, she says, from watching how much faster the oldest wood in the current stack burned compared to whatever had gone in most recently. Earl has started drawing up rough sketches on graph paper at his kitchen table in town, the 2 of them meeting most Sunday afternoons to argue amiably over spacing and pitch. Opal Sizemore still calls her most weeks to ask if there is anything else on the old barn worth hauling off before the whole structure finally gives way to time. And her granddaughter has taken to riding out with Nettie on weekends, the 2 of them now marking trees together with the same hatchet and notebook method Nettie started with on her own. Roy Combs asked her, before the snow melted, if she would walk his own land with him come spring and help him figure out where a second one of these might go. And he has since torn down 1 bay of his old flat-roofed shed to make room for it. Mrs. Pruitt's 4 handwritten pages are still taped into the back of that old bound volume at the branch library, a little worn at the corners now from other hands turning them over. What has this story taught you about making do with what other people have already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones about quiet determination and the kind of knowledge that gets built by hand rather than bought at a store, subscribe, and we will see you again next week.